Great. What is your name, please?
Yeah, Adam Olsen. Yeah, that's my name. I'm the MLA for Saanich North in the Islands. I'm a member of the Tsartlip Village in the Saanich territory, which we're in here. And my traditional Coast Salish name is Tsartlip, and I'm happy to email because it's a different alphabet. So if you want to use that, you can as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So you have been very active in Parliament about what's been going on in the Fairy Creek blockade and about environmental issues in British Columbia in general. Just for people who aren't familiar, how would you summarize the situation in terms of your perspective in Fairy Creek?
Well, basically, the BC government has continued the Crown forestry policy that has been going on in this province for decades, frankly. It's incredible to see how decades passed and the same conversations continue to be happening. Just reading a book, Following the Good River, and it's talking about Crown forestry policy and old growth review strategies and deferrals of old growth cutting across the province. That was 25, 30 years ago. We're having that same conversation today because the Crown continues to grind away with their forestry policy. And so basically what's happening in Fairy Creek is what's happened in British Columbia over the decades. We have to protect old growth, one valley, one hillside at a time, which what we're talking about in the legislature right now is about having an old growth strategy that protects these really, really sensitive ecosystems that are at risk of biodiversity loss. And we've been basically saying the same thing that people have been saying for decades in this province, and still the Crown governments continue to do what they, cut and run, talk and log forestry policy that we've seen for decades.
For people who aren't familiar with the BC recent election, can you maybe just tell us what happened? I'll just let you take it on.
Well, I'd say that for the past 3.5 or 4 years, Sonia and I have been pretty focused. My colleague Sonia First, MLA for Cowichan Valley. We've been very focused on forestry policy and particularly old growth. We've been calling on the government. We only get one question a day with a supplemental. More often than not, we're using it on forestry policy. So we've been asking the government, and they did an old growth review strategy panel report that then was going to be developing a strategy out of it, which, like I said, this is not the first time that this has happened in the province, but here we are again, doing it again. So the government promised to do that report. They did it. They brought the recommendations forward. They went into an election last September of 2020, with the commitment that they were going to implement recommendations. And it was, very deliberate language. They fell well short of talking about implementing all the recommendations of their own report. During the election, just the conversation that went, the questions that came up in the different leaders' debates, Sonia really pushed Premier John Horgan. Eventually, he committed to implementing all 14 recommendations of the Old Growth Review Panel. John Horgan got his majority government that he was looking for when he called the snap election during the pandemic. The BC Greens retained the 2 seats that we had, and so our position stayed the same as it was previous to the election, although we had advanced the government's position, if only very slightly. We had advanced the position on their agreement to implement all of the recommendations. I think what we've seen over the last number of months is a lot of shifty rhetoric around this, and I think how they're choosing to implement it is really not how the authors of the report intended to, I don't think. So, they've really put ahead recommendation number 1, which is relationships with Indigenous people. As an Indigenous person, I'm not going to complain about that. That's something that we should be doing all the time. But to think that those recommendations came in a chronological order is just not the case. There are recommendation number 6 is the immediate deferral of high-risk ecosystems. If you wait to do all of the other things first, those ecosystems are going to be gone because we're going to continue to cut them. So what came out of the last election was the government was in a significantly different position than when they went in. They went in saying that they were going to do something, and at least we got them to say that they were going to do the whole thing. But now how they're actually operationalizing that and going to execute it is proving to be challenging, not only for us in the legislature, but for British Columbians who want old growth to be protected.
Good, so let's just back up a little bit about
Sure.
going to the election again. Do you think that John Horgan played politics with the election to get the Greens out so he could have a majority government?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. The narrative in the legislature, okay, let me back up. The BC Greens are the only party asking in the legislature on a regular basis, or at all actually, about old growth. The BC Liberals, when they were in power, wanted it cut. They were cutting it. The BC NDP previously in the 1990s, they wanted it cut. They were cutting the old growth. It's only when the government finally succumbs to the demands of British Columbians demanding the protection of these old growth forests that they actually do something about it. And so, it's very uncomfortable for the BC NDP, and it would be very uncomfortable for a BC Liberal government to have 2 Greens or 4 Greens or however many Greens in the legislature asking these questions, because we are the only legislators that have proven to be willing to stand up for old growth in the province. So, I think that it was partly around old growth. I think probably when you can reduce the legislature to a binary, us good, them bad, really kind of base politics of binaries, that's just simple for the established parties to continue to be able to say, we did this, they did nothing, we're so great, they're so awful, right? But when the Greens are in the mix, we can get up and ask an uncomfortable question. And as we've seen, we have over time slowly moved the government from their position to their backs firmly, in the corner, and with really nowhere to turn on this issue. They had to say increasingly more positive things about protecting old growth than they were prepared to do. And even when they tried to kind of take a half measure and say, we're going to, like I said, we're going to implement recommendations. It's like, well, how many? Which ones? Where? When? How? These are all questions that the Greens are willing to ask that BC Liberals never ask. In fact, in question period, I don't think the BC Liberals have ever asked a question about old growth forests. And so in that context, having the NDP call an election to try to kind of exercise this demon, I would say, on this question, would have been very advantageous for them if we didn't win our seats back.
Let's pick up on the experience of you in the legislature. You've been very vocal, and for people who are, let's say, pro-saving the old growth forests, I think have been very admired by what you've been asking in the legislature. What's the response been from the government towards your questions?
Well, I think the government just is gaslighting us. I think they never ask the question. They never answer the questions directly. They use numbers to their own benefit. They use rhetoric around their commitments to Indigenous reconciliation to their benefit, and not to the Indigenous nations' benefit at all. They have become more and more hostile when we're asking the questions, very uncomfortable about it. And certainly for a political party that has had its base on southern Vancouver Island, to have Fairy Creek in our own backyard must hurt, because the reality is we're not talking about a riding that's outside of Vancouver Island, where the NDP have enjoyed a lot of support. To have us asking these questions must be more than annoying. It must be very, very frustrating for them, because it would be very simple for them to be able to not have to be held accountable if it was just BC Liberals, BC NDP binary that we've seen in this province. So, I think that obviously I'm speaking from a place of, I think that we do good work, but I think the BC legislature benefits from having the Green voices in there asking questions that wouldn't be asked if we weren't there.
Let's pick up on Indigenous reconciliation. It's a very complicated issue. There's hereditary lineages. Yeah. There is band council and elected councils, which has been sort of a colonial imposition placed on to bands in some situations.
Entirely a colonial imposition, yeah.
Entirely a colonial imposition in place. But a lot of people don't understand the difference. And so what does Indigenous reconciliation mean to you?
Well, I think it's recognizing that the question about land and resources in this province is not as simply defined as the provincial government and federal government would like the people to believe it is. The reconciliation is a word that I think has been used by a lot of people and probably misunderstood by a lot of people, but we have to acknowledge where we have come from, and we have to acknowledge the fact that there has been policy imposed upon Indigenous people by Crown governments going back hundreds of years out in the East Coast and 180 years here on the BC coast, that was designed to significantly limit Indigenous people's ability to participate in society. There was the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of terra nullius, that this was empty land, and so therefore, basically the policy said that on non-Christian lands, European explorers had the right to be able to claim sovereignty over that land because it was empty, completely disregarding Indigenous people that were here. And that's the foundation that our government, the institution that I've been elected to, that's the core of the debate that's happening in our province right now is around ownership and control over land and resources. So when we're talking about trees, when we're talking about mining, and we're talking about fishing, the right to be able to extract those resources, who can benefit from them. Reconciliation is coming to terms with the fact that what we see here today is not naturally occurring. There's human constructs all over the place. The band councils, chief and councils are a construct of the Indian Act. That doesn't mean that there wasn't governance here. In fact, there was really, really sophisticated and beautiful Indigenous governance structures that if we embraced them, we could not only learn a lot about the places that we live and the places that we are, but we would also be able to see the solutions right in front of us. Whereas right now, when we look for the solutions, it feels like they're so far away from us. So, I think one of the things that the provincial government in BC is coming to terms with is that you can't any longer state that you are embracing reconciliation and then do the other thing. There are people that are going to call you out. I'm one of them. I will be continuing to call the government out on their desire to say one thing and do another. And when it comes to Fairy Creek, and when it comes to Indigenous reconciliation, and when it comes to the language that Premier John Horgan allows to flow from his mouth so easily, it doesn't work. You can't reconcile it. You can't say that you believe in Indigenous rights, title, and sovereignty, and be sending your ministers out to sign agreements that at the core of those agreements, designed by the BC Liberals, at the very core is a denial of rights. Those two actions, or the statement and the action, cannot be reconciled. And so at some point, that Premier and the government needs to be accountable for the words that they say, because they mean things. You can't just stand up and say, I agree with Indigenous title, I agree with Indigenous rights, I agree with Indigenous sovereignty, and then have no intention of actually following through on them. And in fact, the opposite is what's happening in this province right now. They're saying those things, and then they're locking Indigenous nations into the same kind of forestry and resource extraction agreements that the BC Liberals were using, that when the NDP was in opposition, they were really critical of those agreements. And the conversation is often framed not in the context of how do we, between the government and the Indigenous nation, say, well, okay, and the Premier said this to me, or to Sonia in budget estimates, well, these are agreements being signed between Party A and Party B. What he's trying to say is that, that there is, this free and prior consent that's happening. But really the conversation is not happening in that context. The conversation is happening in the context of the cut block just over the hill has been approved. The corporate interests are ready to saw. So you're either going to get a small amount of economic benefit from that activity, or you're not. As the former Minister of Forests and Lands, Doug Donaldson, said, the former NDP minister, as he said, these are take it or leave it agreements. You can take the money that we're offering, or you can leave it and get nothing. And for Indigenous nations who have been deliberately cut out through government policy out of the economic equation, what are you to do? Like it is not a free and prior consent relationship that the Premier wants to hide behind. It's the opposite of that. He knows it's the opposite of it. That's what's so distressing about the language that he is using. He is well aware that he is advancing this notion that is broadly more acceptable today than it has ever been of Indigenous reconciliation, of consent-based decision-making. Even our relationships here are consent-based. I'm standing here because I consented to be here with you today. We're doing this, and we continue to check in. Like, that is a very basic principle of our human interaction that this government is not even following through on. They're basically saying, and if you read the agreement, it says, this is about achieving the Crown's objectives, which is to cut those trees over Crown land within traditional territory. They're establishing a hierarchy of rights, and they say, no, we're not. But the agreement is very clear that there is a hierarchy of rights. This is Crown land. In order to be able to achieve the Indigenous title part of it, or the Indigenous rights over it, you either have to negotiate a treaty or you have to go to court. Indigenous nations that are in treaty have been languishing there for 30 years. It is one of the most frustrating parts of our history is that the government said, let's enter into treaty. And then they just kind of grind away at the negotiation table, never going anywhere until the Crown interests align, and then all of a sudden there's a treaty that's signed, and you're like, wow, how did that move so quickly? It's like, oh, right, the forestry, oh, right, the mining, or oh, right, and then you can see that the Crown had some inertia behind it because there was a potential opportunity for revenue to the Crown Treasury. And then litigation. The Indigenous nations that are in litigation right now, it's like my dad went to the Supreme Court of Canada. It was, 10 or 12 years of his life. The Tsilhqot'in case was, 25 years before it came to a resolution. So it's really despicable to suggest that that the ways that you can kind of reframe the language in those forest and range consultation and revenue sharing agreements is through treaty or through litigation or through some kind of agreement making process with the government, that unless their interests are directly involved, those conversations don't happen at any pace whatsoever. They're just this grinding pace. And one Indigenous leader told me one day, she said, Adam, so often the next meeting starts at exactly the same place as the last meeting started at. And when you think about that, when you think that Indigenous leaders are going in good faith to sit at the table with these Crown governments, and the meetings go nowhere. So if you take a look at what an Indigenous chief and council, the chief and council of a Indigenous nation has to manage, they have to manage international relations between the nation and the federal government. They have to manage the whole portfolio of business that a provincial government manages. They have to manage the territorial interests of resource extraction and development, all of the real estate interests around, everybody filing notifications about this or that. They've got to be able to process all that. So there's all that. And in addition, the healthcare, the education, the elders, the children and families. The chief and council's managing that portfolio of responsibilities, and they're also managing the portfolio of responsibilities of the local government. So your municipal, so land use, all the bylaws are around noise and animal control, and like all of these things that are done at the local government level is also on the chief and council. So if your councillors are going to meetings with different levels of orders of government, and they're just getting ground down at the same places where the meeting started the last time, now you can start to understand what it is behind the comments that I'm making, the sharp comments that I'm making, that our Premier knows better than to suggest that this is some kind of free and prior consent relationship that he's striking up. What they're doing is what I think Stuart Phillip, the Grand Chief Stuart Phillip from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs said, which is preying on poverty, and that's really despicable.
Yeah, we've heard very similar things on the ground, that the nations have been strong-armed to taking pennies for. But on a side note, or moving on, the injunction...
I try to keep my answers very short, as you know. Yeah, so good luck.
That's great. No, I have a lot to work with. I have some more tough questions. These aren't easy. But so the injunction was passed by the BC Supreme Court. The injunction, the whole court system really is another example of colonial power structure.
Correct.
It's based on a common law system that originates from England. We also recognize in Canada the civil law system that comes from Quebec, originated from France. But there still is a lack of recognition of Indigenous law within the main framework. So where does the authority come from the common law courts to enforce these decisions over Indigenous lands?
What I will say is that it's only in very recent times that we're looking at Indigenous law and taking it seriously and thinking that there was law over the land and or over the water. Mm-hmm. My elders often talk about the schwala, the reef net that we used out in the Salish Sea for our summer fishing, and we talk about that being the law of our people. And so it really guided all of the actions and the interactions when we were out at those fishing locations, how we interacted amongst the different nations and different families and who owned those locations. But it really goes back down to the assertion of sovereignty over the land. That when you go back to the foundation of this province and the foundation of this country is built on the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. Empty land, we found it, we're asserting sovereignty. The Supreme Court of Canada has determined that it's not as simple as that there is a responsibility to recognize that there's multiple sovereigns over these lands. And it really comes down to our responsibility as a provincial government that asserted that authority, that sovereignty over the land, to find a way to balance the sovereign interests of Indigenous nations. The Supreme Court of Canada has determined that it's not complete for either party. So then in that situation, it's not very much different between the federal and provincial government. So you often hear, provincial government authorities going, I have no idea how we're going to be able to do this. And it's like, well, you do it every day with the federal government. There's different levels of government that have different types of authority, and we create tables and create mechanisms for us to be able to balance those interests and those rights that are established through the claims that are made and the law that's been put in place. So there, it is more complex that there's 203 Indian reserves in this province that are governed by the Indian Act. There are about 33 linguistic groups. There's a whole pile of a whole diversity of nations in this province. I'm not underestimating the challenge. I just get fed up with hearing that because it's so complex that we couldn't possibly think of a way to work our way through this. It just doesn't make any sense, and it's just simply it's just simply an expression of laziness, frankly, that until it is in our interest to do it, we're going to find excuses to not do it. Well, I would suggest that what we're looking at right now today is the biggest excuse that we have to do it. And there's many examples throughout history where we're at exactly the same place that we're at today, and we've chosen not to find a way through it. And I'd suggest that anything other than being deeply committed to finding a way through it is of no benefit to anybody. It doesn't benefit the Crown governments that establish themselves based on the statements that they've made. It doesn't benefit Indigenous people. It benefits 0% of the population that lives here. Nobody benefits from us pretending like we're back in 1850 or 1830 or 1790. We are where we are, and we have this opportunity right now with a different sensibility that's been evolving over the last decade to really take advantage of the time and space that we're in to do things differently. And it's going to mean sacrifice. It's going to mean the provincial government is going to have to sacrifice some of the benefits that they've been extracting from these lands, and they're going to have to sacrifice some of the authority that they've been exerting, and they're going to have to give up some of the power that they've become ravenous for, and they're going to have to share it. And if we don't do it, we are going to see more and more instances of Fairy Creek and Wet'suwet'en and happening everywhere, because it's not just Indigenous nations that know that it's wrong. There's a huge segment of the population that is pretty grossed out by what's happening, and it really resonated after the discovery at the residential school in Kamloops that there is a significant population that will accept nothing other than doing what's right. Now, whether or not we know exactly what that is, that's a different conversation to have, but they're expecting us to do something different than what we've always been doing. Protesters started to take to the forest last summer. They started to entrench. The provincial government, the opposition parties, everybody knew that they were out there. The Indigenous nations knew they were out there. Teal Jones knew they were out there. And they entrenched themselves in those places. They created camps. They created, guidebooks. Like there was a lot of there was a well-established protest by the time that we got around to this summer. In the meantime, the government was promising in their rhetoric to be engaging Indigenous nations about deferrals. They were saying that we're implementing the recommendations of the Old Growth Review Panel. These were the answers that they were giving Saanich and I, and we're talking to the Indigenous nations about deferring these sensitive ecosystems that are at risk of biodiversity loss or complete collapse. At the same time, the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation was out renewing the Forest and Range Consultation and Revenue Sharing Agreements that entrench the Crown's desire to cut. So they were doing exactly the opposite thing that they were claiming that they were doing when we were asking these questions in question period. And what's so egregious about this was that they made the situation that was happening at Fairy Creek more difficult. So they almost guaranteed, well, not almost, they guaranteed the result that we see right now through their own actions. And British Columbians need to know that their government made a decision to make this more of a problem than it needed to be. And they also made a decision that they were going to frame this in the light that the only thing that the Indigenous nation would accept is cutting those trees. Because that's the agreement that they signed, was to cut the trees. However, they never put on the table alternatives. They never said, let's put some, as Grand Chief Stuart Phillip and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs said, let's put some conservation financing in place. Let's use the mechanisms that were successful to protect the Great Bear Rainforest. Let's try those. This wasn't a discussion about options. This was a discussion about entrenching the Crown forestry policy, which was to cut. And then, as it started to heat up, now we're at this summer, and as it's heating up, we get a situation where the government says, well, we can't do anything about it now because we need the Indigenous nation to tell us that they want a deferral. It's really distressing. Like, this is the history of what's happened here. They had an opportunity to turn the tension down. They had an opportunity to take the heat off themselves, off the Indigenous nation. Instead, what they did was they placed the Indigenous nation in the middle between the government and the protesters. This was either designed or it was a series of mistakes that really are unacceptable. Because if this government is true on its word about commitments to reconciliation, they're not making the pathway more difficult. They're not putting more obstructions in the way. They're removing obstructions. This government has all the resources. The Indigenous nation has no access to the resources. So to think that they're not offering a conversation with multiple options on it and just saying, here, you take it or leave it, And to think that that's the process that we undertook in the last year is really totally unacceptable. So now your question was what?
There was an injunction that happened.
Yeah, right.
What is this injunction? What does it mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, what we've seen this provincial government do multiple times now is use the RCMP as a way to enforce the corporate rights that the provincial government grants through its tenuring system. Really, they auction off these cut blocks. They give the corporate interests the rights to go and extract all of the economic value off of it. They pull some of the money through stumpage back, and taxes benefit from it. A portion of that gets then put to the given to the First Nation that signs the revenue sharing agreement, a small amount. And then they say basically, if you want access to this and we've got protesters there, then you have to go get an injunction. And so they go get an injunction, and then in comes the RCMP, doing what the RCMP has done on behalf of the Canadian government and on behalf of corporate interests since the RCMP started hundreds of years ago. This is exactly how the RCMP has operated over the years. They have been used to clear the land of any interest that stands in the way of the Crown's desire to harvest as much of the natural resources at whatever pace it chooses to harvest them. And the RCMP was used to clear the land of Indigenous people by bringing them to residential schools. They're being used to clear the land in order to be able to build a pipeline because the provincial government didn't do the work that it needed to do with the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en. And there's a long legal history there. The RCMP has been brought in because this NDP government didn't do the work that they needed to do in order the work that they committed to do to protect old growth ecosystems that are collapsing. So really this injunction is a legal mechanism to be able to clear the land of any objection to Crown forestry policy. Sonia and I were talking about this. I'm very, very interested to find out whether or not the government comes out worse off after all of this than they were at the beginning, because the policing costs are not being, paid for by the corporate interest, because at some point the corporate interest would be like, no, if they had to pay for it, they'd say, no, we're good. We're going to go log somewhere else because it's going to cost us more to enforce the injunction than for us to that we're going to make. But because the taxpayer of British Columbia is going to be on the hook for this, at some point the cost of enforcing this injunction is going to be greater than the provincial government makes on this cut block. And when we cross that line, it will basically show that these actions of this provincial government have been a joke. Like, that's not what we elect provincial governments to do, to use the police force to protect corporate interests at all cost, at any cost. They're building a dam at Site C. Apparently there's no line that they can cross. They're enforcing injunctions. Apparently there's no expense that they won't spend in order to be able to achieve that. And it's a laughable situation if it wasn't so dangerous and so wrong.
But the three nations involved have come to a declaration saying we've asked for a 2-year moratorium on the Fairy Creek watershed. Is that, and then the government has now agreed to that. What does that mean to you? Is it what's going on there?
I think in all of this, what we've seen now is the Huayet, Dididat, and Pachidat are now going to be developing integrated resource management plans for their entire territory, for all the resources that come off the land and out of the water. And I think this is a really important step forward, for sure, in I think achieving the self-determination that is at the core of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that we all signed and passed back in 2019. So I think that there has been some advancement there, although I don't know if it's necessarily exactly what the government intended it to be. I think that it was meant to be a way to get out of a tense situation that they had created through their lack of leadership on forestry plans. But as we said, when the announcement was made, we fully support the Indigenous nations taking control of their territory and how those resources are developed. I believe that it's always going to be a better outcome for nature and the environment, that the people who live on the land and who live in the environment are making decisions for it. I think part of the challenge that we face with the provincial government is that they don't have to live there. They don't have to see the cut blocks. They can drive away. The cut and run is how it's been framed. But the Indigenous people that live on the west coast of British Columbia, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, have to live with the decisions that they make. They have to live in amongst the environment that they're making decisions for. So I think that those decisions are more informed and they're made in a different context than what the provincial government is. So I think it's pretty cool. And I love to watch this as it rolls out and support those nations in the work that they're doing. I think we still do get to a situation where we have harvested far more of these monumental stands of really old, big trees that British Columbians think about when they think about old growth on Vancouver Island. And so there has to be a conversation that has to be put into context when those decisions are going to be made. And that might be part of the more difficult parts of the conversation that have to happen. But that's where the provincial government has a responsibility to step in and say, we've benefited for 150 years financially from this. We extract billions of dollars from the land. And there's a way for us to be able to balance that. Perhaps the old growth that you're viewing now as a way to generate revenue, we might want to protect it. And how can we be a part of that? But for me, I think that it's really important step forward. Now, what's going to be, I think, most important is how the government responds, not just in areas that it needs this. And I think this is a theme through all of the answers that I've given. The government is very responsive when it needs some action. They're far slower when they don't need action or they don't need the area to be cleared. So what's going to be really, really interesting is how does the government respond to areas that they don't have any interest in protecting? The other nations that stand up and say that we want to have land protected.
And there's also been an argument put forward that a 2-year moratorium is to, in some ways, placate the British Columbia population into believing that there's been some sort of social change, and then in 2 years, it'll just all start again. And that in 2 years, this area that's already said it's going to be protected will just be logged.
So we have an opportunity then. We have an opportunity to put different options on the table for those nations, and to help frame a different kind of conversation. This isn't about saying you can't do what you want to do. This is about saying, hey, what about this option that's another viable option that we're putting on the table for you to consider in your land use planning. So over the next 2 years, there's an opportunity to put some pretty serious financial, economic mechanisms and plans in place so that the benefit is to not cut. Just like we saw some of the mechanisms that were put in place on the Central Coast, and I think that there's some work that still needs to be done there. However, I think that there's an opportunity for everybody that wants those areas to be protected to work together to find and develop mechanisms that say, look, here's an option for you. Consider it in your integrated resource plan. So maybe it's a 2-year deferral. Maybe they make a decision that they want to cut in 10 years. Maybe we can put a package in place over the next 10 years, whether it be the provincial government or private interests, in investment from other parts of the world, to say, look, there's also a really good economic case to be made because we're putting it in front, we're putting it on the table to not cut. And that's the benefit of time that we have right now. So yes, British Columbians should absolutely be cynical. They should absolutely be as cynical as you possibly can, because like I opened this interview with, we're having the same conversation that we were having in 1991. That is unacceptable, but it's where we're at. And so unless we actually kind of change the framework, we are in a hazardous position of having this conversation in 30 years from now, only with far less than what we actually have.
And while the conversation has been around the 2-year moratorium The old growth logging still continues in areas around that are not considered protected within that moratorium. And for example, Kaikous Valley is now completely 100% logged of old growth. It's completely disappeared. So there's an argument that this is a loggers industry, there's jobs associated with it, but we're at a place where there's only 2.7% of old growth forest left. So at one point or another, these people who are employed in the logging industry will no longer have old growth as a source of their employment. What is the future for the logging industry?
Second, I mean, the future of the logging industry in British Columbia is the same as what the logging industry in Europe is. You know, what did they do in Europe after they logged all the old growth? Well, they got in a boat and they went around the world looking for other old growth to log. Well, we can't get in a boat and go around the world and look, you know, that time has passed too. So we're going to have to start developing a robust, a much more robust, you know, land use planning process in this province that recognizes the environmental values that British Columbians have. You know, tourism Vancouver Island right now is selling this dream of Vancouver Island that is absolutely kind of antithetical to the one that actually, to the reality of the world that we live in, right? Showing all these big old growth trees and everything. It's like, well, that, you know, people are going to come to try to go see those ecosystems, and they're not going to be there. But we've sold that to them. Thank you. We've sold that dream to them. And what they need to see is actually what we've been doing, which is destroying those areas. So you know, I think you know, the people that I talk to know that this is done 4 to 5 years from now. And they say, well, in the next decade, there isn't a decade ahead. So we can continue to cut old growth based on the jobs narrative, which is what the NDP have been rolling out as one of the main, you know, anchors to their argument of why we need to continue this activity. But they're also not even putting in place the programs to support these workers in transition. So they're saying, well, we can't just stop it now because, you know, because these people need these jobs tomorrow. It's like, well, at some point in the very, very near future, we're going to be at this spot anyway. So it's incumbent upon this government to put in place the programs that help people transition from one industry to the next. Look, we must continue this practice because there's still British Columbians that benefit from cutting old growth. There is, absolutely. And there used to be far more than are today. And if we don't support those workers in transition today, they will be standing with nothing left to cut in a very few short years from now, and we will have done nothing to protect the old growth, and we will have done nothing to protect the people that were benefiting from that industry. And we'll all be standing around thinking, well, that wasn't very smart. And we have an opportunity right now to turn that corner and to do something different. And we're still, you know, being responded to in question period with rhetoric and gaslighting that just basically, it just doesn't make any sense. And every time I ask the question and post the video, I get at least, you know, 90% of the comments are like, how can the minister not see what everybody else in the province is seeing?
We have seen now a piecemeal situation where we have the Fairy Creek, we have Wet'suwet'en, we have lots of these different sort of pockets that have developed. But is this the future of protest in British Columbia? Is it going to be space by space, area by area, or is there the possibility of a comprehensive plan for the future of British Columbia? What is your thoughts on?
Well, our politics is piece by piece, right? It's 4 years at a time, 4 years at a time, 4 years at a time. So when you think about the ability to do proper, decades-long, 7 generations land use planning, the democratic structure that we have, the political structure that we have actually doesn't really encourage that long-term thinking. So as I said at the very beginning of this interview, we are having the same conversation today that they were having in the early 1990s. Protecting one valley at a time, protecting one watershed at a time, protecting one piece of rainforest at a time. And so I would like to say that no, the answer to your question is that this is not the future of protest in the province. This is the past, though. We are seeing what happened in the past play out again. And, you know, perhaps the way we're tracking right now, I have this really uncomfortable feeling that no, this isn't the future of the protest in British Columbia, because there ain't enough of that trees left for my kids to be protesting about this. Because by the time my kids and the next generation get wound up to protest about something, it won't be about old growth if we continue on the track that we're on. I am the last generation of Saanich people that got a chance to fish in the Saanich Inlet. It's a pretty hardcore thing to say, because generations of my family going back longer than we can than can be traced have been fishing in that inlet. But it was my generation that quit, because there was no point in going out there anymore. I mean, it's nice to go out for a day of boating, but if you're going out for fishing, you need to go somewhere else because there's no fish there. We're getting to a point where there won't be any point of protesting old growth because it will be all cut down. And so I hope that there is a future of protesting old growth, because that means we would have won and we would have protected something. And we would have left some of it there for us to protest the predators who want to take it out, the endangered species hunters.
For people who feel very disenfranchised by voting for a government and then feeling betrayed by that vote, and I think there's a lot of people who we've spoken to who certainly feel that way,
Yep.
What would you say to them to give them hope in terms of the democratic process in British Columbia? Is there hope in our current system? Does it need to change? How can we really represent the will of the people in terms of environmental protection, Indigenous reconciliation, and all of the other sort of social ills that we face right now as a society?
So the currency of the Legislative Assembly, the currency of the politicians in the Legislative Assembly is votes. So, you know, I think when it comes right down to it, we can continue to get trapped in the narrative that I have to vote for them because they're so bad. But we also have to wake up to the fact that we've heard that so often. We have now voted for the less worst option, I guess is the way to put it. And what do we get? Exactly the same policy. With the NDP, we get the same forestry policy as the BC Liberals. With the NDP, we get the same forest and range consultation and revenue sharing agreements that they stood up and yelled about were being so unfair to Indigenous people that the BC Liberals brought in place. The currency of the Legislative Assembly for the politicians in there are votes. It's how we that's how we maintain the seat that we're in, or win a seat that the political party that you're a part of doesn't have. So British Columbians, it does come down to being willing to step outside of what's been comfortable, voting for the binary, right of center, left of center, however you want to frame it, BC Liberals, BC NDP. And what we've seen in the BC legislature with the addition of the BC Greens, for better or for worse, and there's people who've got a range of opinions about the work that we do, and I accept that. That's our democracy. But what it comes right down to it is that with the addition of 2 Greens, we are asking questions that would never have been asked on old growth. We're asking questions about fossil fuel subsidies that would never be asked if we weren't there. So, and I can imagine if we add 2 to 3 or 5 or 10 seats from another party, that you're also going to get a bunch of questions that wouldn't be asked if it was just a binary, where you could say, we're good and they're bad. And by the way, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you sit on, both sides of the aisle have been saying, we're good and they're bad. But when you add other voices into the legislature, and we work under a first past the post system, and it's a real challenge, but we've shown that you can break through. You know, if you do good work, if you work hard, if you invest the time and space to do it, you can break through the first past the post system. It's not all bleak. And I think that what what those people who are feeling disenfranchised about who they voted for and the outcomes that they've got from that vote need to do is vote for somebody else next time. Give someone else a chance. Because, you know, there are certain topics that the BC Liberals simply can't touch because the only response that the NDP give is, well, when you were in power, you did worse. It's like, well, that's not a debate. That's not a discussion. You know, and what's stopping, why can't the BC Liberals ask that, even if they did mess it up, why can't they ask the question and hold the government accountable today? But, you know, the government can slide out of answering the question because they can just point to, for 16 years, you were worse than we are. And it's like, this is really, or when the BC Liberals stand up and say, in the 1990s, you were awful. And it's just like, oh my goodness, like this is 2021. We have a very serious set of health emergencies. We've got ecological emergencies. We've got climate change. And we've got governments that are of both stripes. Apparently a socialist party acting like a free enterprise party. And we've got a free enterprise party now acting like a socialist party. It doesn't matter. If there's not those other voices in the place, there's nobody there holding both of that binary debate accountable. And that's what we're doing. And I think that's the exciting part about adding different voices to the legislature. Heck, add some independents. You know, add an independent or two into the legislature. See how they, you know, what they bring to the debate. Add other political parties. You know, take a look at candidates for what they have to offer the debate and vote for them based on that, rather than just saying the only way that we're going to be able to do it is to have a strong majority government. We see what a strong majority government is doing. They're not responsive to the public. They continue to roll out tired narratives that frankly people are growing frustrated with.